Greetings and welcome to another edition of Alusine Multicultural Family Consulting. Today's topic, like the other series I've been presenting, is just as important because it concludes the process view of communication. When we talk of the process view, the introduction, the types, the model, the self-concept, perception, verbal, non-verbal, and today's topic concludes those series. And that topic is the topic of listening. Listening is very important because listening is an active process, not a passive process. A good listener, the speaker is excited, the listener is excited. The speaker is sad, a tear can fall down the eye of the listener. So it's not a passive process, but an active process. Listening is more than just hearing. Hearing is physiological, the sound waves. Listening goes beyond hearing. Listening is understanding. Listening is comprehending. Listening is remembering. Listening is responding. All of those are aspects of listening. So what's the definition of listening? Well, the definition is that listening is an active process of selecting, receiving, understanding, organizing, evaluating spoken messages. That's what listening is. Listening is important for many reasons. One, you have to be a good listener to develop and to maintain relationships. Sometimes understanding the messages from your partner, what they encode, how you decode those messages are part of ways we initiate as well as develop messages. So listening is important because it's a means to develop as well as to maintain relationships. Listening is also important because if you are a good listener, you increase your knowledge, you learn more. The world is filled with information to be consumed through listening. Even in this technological age, we need more listening skills. So a second importance of listening is you increase your knowledge. A third is career success. You become successful on the job. Most employers say we need people with good communication skills. And the required communication competency is the ability to listen, to understand what's expected, to understand what's going on. So that's a third reason why listening is important, career success. Listening is also important because listening leads to self-protection. Sometimes when you hear someone's sentiments or ideas or what they say, you may know how to react to spoken messages. So those are reasons why listening is important. There are many reasons why the intended message is not the passive message sometimes when we listen. One is noise. To listen, we have to be silent. Sometimes physiological or physical noise can act as barriers to effective listening. Another barrier to listening is preoccupation with self. The what's in it for me. If I don't hear what's in it for me, I don't want to hear it. Preoccupation with self. Another barrier to listening is the self-serving bias. Sometimes if the person is not saying what we want to know in relation to what we expect or want, that self-serving bias can be a barrier to listening. Another is selective listening. So there are many barriers to effective listening. So far I've defined listening. I've talked about the importance of listening and the barriers to effective listening. Now let's look at the skills that have been studied that encourage effective listening. Well, one skill to be a good listener is to be silent. Sometimes to understand someone, we have to stop talking. So being silent until you hear the message is a good way we listen. Sometimes we have the tendency to worry about what do I say now. A good listener forgets about themselves. The focus is on the speaker, their attention, their thoughts. So, silence. Another skill that encourages listening is the use of door openers. Somebody comes to me with a problem or concern. A way to listen is to say, sit down, tell me about it. I would like to hear what you have to say. It sounds like you need someone to talk to. So a door opener creates an invitation to focus attention on what the speaker has to say. Another skill that encourages listening is parroting. Parroting is repeating word for word what the speaker says. Parroting is annoying if it's the only skill we use. Anytime somebody says something, we repeat word for word. But there are some situations where parroting is essential. Matters dealing with money, matters dealing with emergency, I parrot. Another skill that encourages listening is paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is when you summarize in your own words the content of the speaker's message. It's not everything the speaker says, but what are the key ideas? What are the main points? What's the speaker expressing? That's paraphrasing. You summarize in your own words. Another skill that encourages listening is active listening. In active listening, we identify the emotional tone of the message. It's not what the speaker says, but what's the emotion with which they communicate. I'm excited, I'm happy, I'm angry. Sometimes the tone of voice, the emotion with which the speaker communicates. When you identify that, that's active listening. It's also called therapeutic listening. Another skill that encourages listening is critical listening. Critical listening, when we listen to assess the soundness of messages. Say you listen to someone give a speech, how do you critically listen to assess? Sometimes we weigh the evidence the speaker presents. Sometimes we look at the arguments. Sometimes we look at the speaker's introduction, their main points, how they relate to the receivers, the content of their discussion. All of those are ways we listen critically when we listen to assess whether a message is sound. There is no one way to listen, but when we know the definition, the importance, the barriers, the types of listening, it enables us to understand two things. Some say listening is a cognitive process. In other words, when I listen, I try to understand what the speaker is thinking and saying. Some say listening is an affective process. When I listen, I identify the emotion with which the speaker communicates. So there are variations in the ways we listen. Some are people-oriented listeners. People-oriented listeners, they address other people's issues. Some say, what are we going to do about it? Then you have task-oriented listeners. They listen to get the job done. You can take your story somewhere else, get the job done. Then you have content-oriented listeners. Those who want the information so they can analyze it are content-oriented listeners. Then you have relationship-oriented listeners. Those who listen to reinforce and to maintain relationships. So there are many things to say, but listening is important. There is a guy by the name of Zeno or Citium who makes a joke about listening. He said we've been given 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we may hear more and talk less. Listening is important. Some think it's the speakers who know what's going on. Arguments can be made that it's the listeners because they understand. They decode spoken messages. There is a culture wherein sometimes you have the spoken chief and the silent chief. When an issue comes up, they both are in the same room. Then the silent chief will confer with the spoken chief because they understand, they comprehend, they relate to the discourse. So that's my take on listening. And this concludes the series on the fundamental principles of communication, the definition, the self-concept, perception, verbal, non-verbal, and listening. My concluding statement on the topic of listening is that there is no one way to listen, but practice the skills, observe the skills, explain the skills as they relate to listening. Someone once said, it's only when we listen that we hear the song of the words. And sometimes we can play when we listen. So I hope you've listened to my topic, and I'll be back with more editions from Alusine Multicultural Family Consulting. And check my books. My goal is primarily to educate, to inform in a common way that addresses our common humanity. So try listening and understanding and interpreting some of the skills. Thank you, and as always, God bless.